Today's guest is contributor to The Gray Zone. He's the winner of the I.F. Stone Izzy Award for Independent Journalism, and he's the host of Pushback. You can read his work at his Substack at mate.substack.com. I'm a subscriber. Please welcome award-winning journalist Aaron Mate. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Hey, D. How you doing? I'm good.
Doing fantastic. So let's get in. We're going to go over this story. So there's a story about, what's happening. You did it. So I'm going to go over it. And then you can be here to clarify all the stuff I don't understand. So, they're trying to ramp up a war with the nuclear power called Russia over Ukraine. And you wrote a Substack. And it starts off with stoking war with Russia. U.S. media is Biden's top ally. And if you look at the graphics, it says White House Russian invasion of Ukraine could begin during the Olympics. Oh, my God. Boy, nobody is watching the Olympics, huh? Nobody. And so here's the article. It says, despite repeated humiliations for all involved, prominent outlets have proved to be a consistent vehicle for laundering pro-war disinformation to the U.S. public. Despite repeated humiliations, come on, what was so embarrassing? Ned Price stammering like a dishonest idiot? Or the fact that the president of Ukraine asked Biden to stop escalating and shut his mouth? Or the 20-year disaster of a war that we just lost to people less well-equipped than Russia? Was that I don't know if that was the humiliating part. We'll see. And while front-page headlines and cable news chyrons have adhered to strict narrative discipline, the White House's actual, and perhaps only, core principle in Ukraine can sometimes be found buried in the back pages of top U.S. newspapers, safeguarding U.S. hegemony. Absent from virtually all news coverage is the background that helps explain how we got here. The post-Cold War drive to expand NATO at the behest of D.C. neoconservatives and their arms industry funders. Well, why would we need to know that history? Let's just keep moving forward without acknowledging or learning from failure. We're Americans, after all, aren't we? Okay. The 2014 U.S.-backed Maiden coup that ousted a Ukrainian president who resisted Western efforts to cut off ties to Russia and impose crippling neoliberal austerity. Wait, are you saying, Aaron, that we interfered with a sovereign nation's elections? That doesn't sound like the United States. Well, I'm sure if we did, we had good reason to do it, and it really helped. Okay, here we go. Hold on. The critical role of neo-Nazis and fascists in that coup and their increased influence inside Ukraine in the years since, the U.S. refusal to actively support, if not direct orders to thwart, Kyiv's implementation of the 2015 Minsk II Accords, which would grant the rebel Donbas region autonomy in return for its demilitarization. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so you're telling me, Aaron, that we actually backed a neo-Nazi coup? Whoopsie daisy. And hey, did you hear Joe Rogan said the N-word? What about Joe Rogan? Am I right? So, Aaron, would you explain this to me? So the critical role of neo-Nazis and fascists in that coup. So there was a coup. The United States was on the side of the Nazis. Is that what you're saying, Aaron?
Yeah. So backing it up just by a couple months. So late 2013, the Ukrainian president at the time, Yanukovych, he is going to sign this major agreement with the West. And it was one that the US and the EU were really, really pushing on him. And basically it would have forced him to seriously curtail economic and cultural ties to Russia, which is Ukraine's neighbor. And it would bring Ukraine further into the Western orbit, which was a major goal of the US regime change pro-war lobby at the time. The head of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the regime change arm of the CIA, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post at the time, calling Ukraine the biggest prize for the US in its goal to basically undermine Russia. And he explained that if Ukraine can come into the US orbit, then that will actually have an impact in Russia and possibly lead to Vladimir Putin's overthrow and make every neocon in Washington the happiest neocons in the world. So the US pressures Yanukovych to sign this trade agreement. But there's a problem. Yanukovych realizes at the last minute that, oh shit, if I sign this, I'm going to have to cut pensions and I'm going to have to cut energy subsidies. And this will doom my reelection campaign. This is not going to fly. So he gets cold feet. And Russia sweeps in and sees an opportunity. And they offer him a more generous trade association deal, which he then says he is going to sign. And they also use some coercive measures too. But the point is, he caves and says, I'm going to go with Russia. That then sets off these major protests against Yanukovych. And the U.S. gets firmly behind the protests. And there's a major part of those protests that are legitimate. They're anti-corruption, and Yanukovych was very corrupt. But the problem is, there's also an element that is fascist and neo-Nazi. And they don't just want an end to corruption. They want regime change. And the U.S., as it often does, skillfully basically puts its weight behind the fascist elements. John McCain, Chris Murphy go over there, meet with a far-right leader, put their arms around him in Maidan. And all this culminates basically in a violent coup that forces Yanukovych to flee. And he does so only after there is an agreement brokered with the EU to hold new elections. And this coup undermines that. And the U.S. definitely is on the side of the far right, because we know that now from that leaked phone call that came out around then, that Victoria Nuland, who was then a top senior State Department official, she's now back working for Joe Biden, basically running his Ukraine policy again. There's a leaked phone call where she's speaking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, and they're picking the next Ukrainian prime minister. Nuland says Yats is the guy. And that's a reference to Yatsenyuk, who, lo and behold, a few weeks later became the prime minister. So the U.S. was heavily involved in this coup, and that sets off this 8-year conflict that we're still dealing with now, and that has led to this major geopolitical standoff. Russia responded to that coup by seizing Crimea because this new Ukrainian government was talking about joining NATO, and Russia was faced with the prospect of having NATO absorb its most important naval base in Crimea. So Putin took Crimea, which of course angered neocons in Washington, and you have the separatist war in the East break out. And for the separatist war, a major fighting force, and they've been integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces, is something called the Azov Battalion, which has its roots in Nazism and is a, if not a neo-Nazi militia now, I think they are, but even if you want to be generous, they're certainly neo-fascist, and that's who the U.S. is siding with inside of Ukraine.
And so it has to do, so this NATO membership, right? And so now I've heard that the Ukraine is willing to withdraw their possible membership in NATO so they can avoid a war with Russia. Have you heard that?
Yeah, so the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK said that in a radio interview, that Ukraine is now willing to consider taking off the table its request for NATO membership. And, this seems like an explosive concession, but it's also one that everybody admits is reality anyway. Zelensky the president of Ukraine, has never expected that Ukraine will join NATO. In fact, the Wall Street Journal recently reported, and I wrote about this, that Zelensky basically asked to join NATO because he wanted to look tough. That's the wording of the Wall Street Journal, that Zelensky wanted to look tough in the face of Russia and in the eyes of the Biden administration. So that's why he asked for it. And Biden has said that Ukraine will not be joining NATO, at least anytime soon, because they're so divided and so corrupt. But because the U.S. insists on being able to dictate the policies of the entire world, it doesn't want to give Russia this symbolic win by taking NATO off the table. And that's what's driving so much of this current crisis.
And so a big part of this, again, is the establishment news media just repeats CIA talking points uncritically. And there's a video you tweeted out of Peter Engel, who's a foreign correspondent.
Richard Engel, yeah.
But Richard Engel, who's a foreign correspondent for NBC News. And he launched this report, and let me play it for you, and then we'll tell you what's wrong with it. Okay, here we go.
Some communities are taking matters into their own hands. Just across from Russia, in the city of Mariupol, some Ukrainians are preparing. Basic training for the whole family. Learning first aid to treat gunshot and shrapnel wounds. And weapons training. On a 7.62 caliber AK-47 is Valentina Konstantinovskaya. The 79-year-old is a retired accountant and a great-grandmother.
You're about my mother's age, and I can't picture my mother laying down on the concrete learning how to fire an assault rifle. Do you think you would actually be doing this?
Yes, if Putin comes, I should be able to shoot. The threat is very serious, she says, and I think every person in our country should be able to shoot from the window or on the street if the enemy comes.
So What do you think is wrong with that video there? So now Peter Engel's over there. He's interviewing these Richard Engel's over there interviewing these sweet grandmothers who just want to defend their own country. And well, first of all, if you know anything about that lady, which we found out, it's unbelievable. But even more so, look at this. I don't know, Aaron, tell people what this is. So all those soldiers that were help training those women, they're wearing this and this insignia on their uniform. And Aaron, tell people what that is.
That's the insignia of the Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi fascist militia that even the U.S., even though it's supporting these militias inside Ukraine, it's so afraid of the Azov Battalion that there's even on the books, U.S. law bans military assistance to the Azov Battalion. John Conyers got this passed when he was in Congress because it's recognized that they are a neo-fascist, neo-Nazi militia. And Richard Engel is such a dupe that he went to this stupid media stunt. We're being shown a great grandmother firing a weapon. And it didn't even occur to them to check who were the people training these Ukrainian civilians. And it turns out, because they didn't do that, they got duped by neo-Nazis. And it speaks to the integral role of neo-fascists inside the Ukrainian armed forces today and in the proxy fight against Russia, that it's the Azov Battalion that is coordinating these media stunts for really credulous Western media dupes like Richard Engel, who's a chief foreign correspondent of NBC News. So today, NBC News just did literal neo-Nazi propaganda. The same network railing all the time about Joe Rogan using the N-word back, many years ago, did literal neo-Nazi propaganda today. And you think any of their so-called fascism experts or disinformation experts are going to say anything about this?
So, wait, isn't it amazing? Isn't it? I don't know. It's odd to me that the same media that tells us there's a Nazi hiding in every Canadian truck fails to mention that we are backing Nazis in Ukraine. Isn't that weird? I think it's weird.
It's really weird. Yes.
I like what they did with the, look how they did their own thing with the Nazi SS symbol, right? They had their own little flair for the net. That's what that is, right? They put a little twist on the SS Thunderbolts. That's what they did.
Well, they do originate in Nazi Germany, out of a militia in Nazi Germany. That is their historical root.
But Aaron, I mean, if we can back ISIS in Syria, backing Nazis in Ukraine is not a big stretch, right?
No, it's not. And by the way, happy anniversary to Jake Sullivan, our current national security advisor, who's keeping the country safe, who 10 years ago, Jimmy, this past weekend, wrote that email to Hillary Clinton, his boss at the State Department, which simply said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria.
Yes.
So Jake Sullivan has gone from siding with Al-Qaeda in Syria to neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
So let me just cover this. Instead of reporting factual information, U.S. media outlets have flooded their audiences with what one Western intelligence official calls a strategic communications campaign. Part one of that communication strategy, don't mention we back actual Nazis. And the second part of that communication campaign, cancel Joe Rogan. That would be it. Here we go. The campaign is described uncritically by CNN as a series of alarming headlines and a drumbeat of official disclosures that have come from agency spokesmen and officials who have provided little by the way of evidence, in effect, asking reporters to report the material without confirmation. In short, a strategic communications campaign of state propaganda. So, what do they mean when they say we have very little evidence? Well, Ned Price told us that is the evidence, right? Whatever he says, that's if there is evidence that they have it. There's evidence that they have evidence, and Ned told you that they have it. So now go report that uncritically. Isn't that how it works, Aaron?
That's exactly how it works. And look, that was the playbook normalized by Russiagate, right? The reason why we stood out and we were called heretics is because we committed the sin of asking for evidence for all these insane claims we got every single week for more than 2 years. And by the way, let me just congratulate Jimmy. Every dupe in U.S. media who played along with Russiagate or didn't challenge it have rendered themselves completely useless right now when it comes to this current Ukraine crisis, because it's the same thing where we're being told to accept government claims on faith, and we're being told that it's in the U.S. interest to saber rattle with Russia. Exactly what we opposed for so long and what was so dangerous about Russiagate, among many things. And so many people, out of careerism or cowardice or whatever it is, didn't challenge it. And they've then rendered themselves now completely ineffective in pushing back on the really, really dangerous moment.
And everybody,
where even the left, even the professional left, like Bernie Sanders and other progressives in caucus, they're ceding the anti-war sentiment to the right.
Yes,
it's insane.
It is insane. But Bernie Sanders is never going to cross Joe Biden, and that's just it. He's never going to cross Joe Biden. So if Joe Biden wants to lie about Ukraine, Bernie Sanders is going to let him. He said, you know, when you say he's the professional left, emphasis on the professional, less emphasis on the left part, because Bernie Sanders is a tool of the establishment. Russia could seize Kiev in days and cause 50,000 civilian deaths in Ukraine. U.S. assessment 5. So that's the kind of news reporting you get. They just repeat the propaganda coming straight from the State Department and the CIA. So I had many more examples of this, but I forgot to load them into this keynote, and now I feel like an idiot because I made Malcolm get them for me, and then I didn't put them in. But anyway, U.S. assessment, huh? Who else? But I'm more than satisfied. Who else needs more evidence than that? How could you possibly want more evidence than that? The U.S. did an ocular pat down like the guy from Always Sunny and has assessed the future. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. An assessment from the U.S. about foreign policy is, I don't know, it's about as worth as much as a promise of sobriety from a Biden. Am I right? Come on. Come on. I have one more slide here. Let's watch it.
По-прежнему пытаются успокаивать рассуждениями о том, что НАТО мирная и сугубо оборонительная организация. Сугубо оборонительная.
So let me start it off and I'll read to you what he's saying.
По-прежнему пытаются успокаивать.
He says they are still trying to reassure Russia with arguments that NATO is a peaceful and purely defensive organization.
Рассуждениями о том, что НАТО мирная и сугубо оборонительная организация, сугубо оборонительный союз.
A purely defensive alliance.
В том, насколько это соответствует действительности.
Citizens of many states have seen their own experience how true this is. I have in mind Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. He's talking about how the NATO is not peaceful.
В собственном опыте убедились граждане многих государств, я имею в виду Ирак, Ливия, Афганистан, но и, собственно говоря,
And he says, and in fact, the corresponding large-scale military operation against Belgrade, Serbia.
Военная крупномасштабная операция в отношении Белграда без санкций Совета Безопасности.
Without the sanction of the UN Security Council.
Это, конечно,
this, of course, he says, this, of course, an event that is far from what a peace organization should do. He's talking about the bombing of Serbia.
Мероприятие далекое от того, что могла бы осуществлять мирная организация.
So that's what Putin had to say about it. He's letting you know that NATO is not a peaceful organization. And, I mean, that's just funny that they would even say that. So what else should people know about this, Aaron?
Well, just that the Biden administration has such a huge responsibility for this current crisis that they're confronting. I mean, they essentially created it. They created it with the Maidan coup, and it's all the same people, Victoria Nuland, Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden's centrality to this whole thing is captured in the fact that there was a reason why powerful people in Ukraine felt obligated to give Hunter Biden a board seat for a gas company paying $80,000 per month. That's because Joe Biden was a very important figure in Ukraine and a major player in the 2014 coup. And so you have to wonder, I mean, you know, for all the conspiracy theories about Trump being compromised by blackmail and leverage, I mean, Biden is so heavily involved with Ukraine that if there's a much more plausible case to make that Biden is actually compromised by blackmail threats and other compromising material, because he was so heavily involved in the coup there. He got the prosecutor fired who was investigating Burisma. And contrary, by the way, to what we hear often, that case was not dormant. That's actually a lie I learned recently from Branko Maritrich, who is a writer for Jacobin, wrote a book about Joe Biden. So all these people, Victoria Nuland, Biden, Jake Sullivan, have a major role in this conflict, and this fear-mongering campaign they've made of a Russian invasion is also based on hype. Russia has been deploying forces to its Ukrainian border for a long time. And in fact, in my article, I have a graphic of years of like fear-mongering headlines going back many years about Russian troop deployments on Ukraine's borders. So really, actually, this troop buildup is not anything that new. We've seen it before. What's different is that the Biden administration is using this for a fear-mongering campaign, every week feeding credulous media panic about an imminent Russia invasion. And the only people who seem to believe it are U.S. media stenographers. You know, Ukraine is constantly telling Biden to stop sowing panic because it's really hurting their economy. People are fleeing, investors are fleeing, companies are fleeing, diplomats are fleeing. It's bad for Ukraine. It's not obviously good for the rest of Europe. It's causing a lot of panic there, but it's good, I guess, for neocons in Washington. And that's right now who is driving policy in the Biden White House.
Okay, if you're getting your information about Ukraine from the corporate news media, you're being misinformed and lied to. Just so you know, just like if you're getting your information on COVID from the corporate news, you're getting in misinformation. So appreciate you tuning in to here, and you can hear Aaron Matei explain it to you and show you where guys like Richard Engel are willing propagandists. Hey, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Philadelphia on February 20th. We just added a second show. And February 26th, back here in Los Angeles, go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets for all our live shows.